poor single dad. Brought his baby to work. She sneaked into the office, napped with the CEO. 4 minutes. That's all it took. Marcus Calloway turned away from the electrical panel just long enough to tighten 2 bolts, and when he looked back down the hallway of the 38th floor, the bench was empty. The toolbox sat untouched. The small stuffed rabbit he'd tucked beside it was gone. He pushed open the only door left ajar on the floor. What he saw stopped every thought in his body. Natalie Brennan, CEO of Brennan and Voss. The woman who had never once let a feeling enter a business decision was asleep on her office sofa, head tilted, perfectly still, and curled against her chest, one tiny fist clutching the lapel of a $4,000 blazer was his 2.5-year-old daughter. Neither of them had called for help. The question is, why didn't she? The 38th floor smelled like climate-controlled air and money. Marcus Calloway had learned that in his first 5 days at Vantage Tower, the way certain floors had their own particular silence, the kind that wasn't natural, but manufactured, maintained the same way the brass elevator fixtures were polished every morning before anyone arrived. He'd worked enough buildings across Manhattan to know the difference between quiet and controlled. The 38th floor was the latter. Every surface suggested that disorder was not permitted here. Every closed door confirmed it. He set his toolbox down beside the hallway bench and looked at his daughter. Lily was already in the middle of an explanation. She'd been explaining things since the moment they left the apartment that morning, starting with why her stuffed rabbit needed to ride in the front pocket of his bag instead of inside it, then moving on to why the subway smelled like soup, and now sitting on the bench with her legs dangling well above the floor, she was telling the toolbox that it was too heavy to carry, and Baba's arms are tired. Lily, Marcus crouched in front of her and placed both hands on her knees. You stay right here, right on this bench. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. Don't touch anything. Lily looked at him with her large brown eyes, the curly hair around her face catching the overhead light. She nodded with the kind of serious expression that meant she had already identified 3 things she intended to do the moment he turned around. He pulled the rabbit from his bag pocket and set it in her lap. Hold on to him. He straightened, grabbed his equipment, and moved to the utility panel 12 feet down the hall. The work itself was straightforward, a faulty junction in the secondary lighting circuit that maintenance had flagged twice in the past month without resolution. Marcus had the panel open in under a minute. He carried out of old habit a portable hard drive clipped to the inner pocket of his bag, a habit from years of building systems he was never quite willing to trust to a single server, back when he had been the kind of person who built systems. He'd carried it so long it had become part of the weight he didn't notice anymore, like the keys in his front pocket and the specific silence of a morning that used to have someone else in it. He focused on the wiring. Behind him, Lily had gone quiet. 3 minutes was how long she managed. It was the door that did it. The office at the far end of the hall had been shut when they arrived. Somewhere in the last few minutes, it had drifted open just a few inches, but enough to release a thin stream of cool air into the hallway. Lily felt it on her ankles first. Then she heard the sound of a second air system running inside, steadier and colder than the hallways. She looked at the rabbit. The rabbit offered no objection. She climbed down from the bench. Natalie Brennan's office was not designed to be comforting. It had been designed to communicate a specific set of facts about the person who occupied it. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that was more architecture than furniture. No photographs, no plants, nothing that softened the geometry of the room. It had worked for years exactly as intended. Lily walked in and decided it needed more color. She placed the rabbit carefully in the center of the desk, positioning it to face the chair. Then she crossed the room to the sofa, tucked in the far corner, a deep charcoal sectional that someone had clearly bought for the aesthetic, and not for sitting, because no one who sat for comfort would have chosen this room to do it in. Lily pressed both palms into the cushion. It was substantially softer than the hallway bench. She climbed up, pulled her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes. She was not asleep. She was waiting. Natalie had been awake for 72 hours. Not continuously. There had been 20 minutes on the car ride back from the Midtown office Tuesday night, and perhaps another 40 at her desk sometime before dawn, but nothing that constituted actual rest. She had a $300 million acquisition moving toward collapse, and a board that was beginning to ask questions she didn't have finished answers to yet. She had been running on coffee and the particular kind of focus that arrives when exhaustion burns past a certain point and becomes something colder and more functional. She had mistaken this for being fine. She came around from behind her desk to retrieve a folder from the side table by the sofa, stopped. There was a child on her sofa, a small child, curly hair, eyes half open now, watching her with an expression of complete calm, as if this were a perfectly reasonable development. Before Natalie could locate the appropriate response, the child reached out and took her hand. Small fingers wrapped around two of hers and pulled gently, but with genuine insistence, downward. "You should sit," the child said. "You look really tired." Natalie Brennan had negotiated with partners who had lawyers in the room. She had walked into board meetings where 3 of the 7 people present wanted her removed. She had delivered bad news to people who had every reason to respond badly, and she had done it without flinching. She sat down. The cushion accepted her weight. The air in the room was very still. Somewhere below, the city continued at its usual volume, but up here, the glass held it at a distance, muffled to something almost like silence. The child had already closed her eyes again. One small hand remained loosely around Natalie's fingers, as if checking that she hadn't left. Natalie did not remember deciding to stay. Marcus came back to an empty bench. The rabbit was gone. The bench was empty. He stood in the hallway and turned in both directions, and the particular cold that moved through him had nothing to do with the climate control. He checked the restroom first, then the stairwell door still latched too heavy for her to have opened. Then he turned back to the hallway and saw the door at the far end and understood. He walked quickly, not running, because running meant something had already gone wrong. He reached the door and put his palm flat on it and pushed it open slowly. The first thing he saw was his daughter's rabbit sitting in the center of the most expensive-looking desk he'd ever been near. The second thing he saw was Lily on the sofa, curled on her side, her breathing slow and even. The third thing, the thing that made him go completely still in the doorway, was Natalie Brennan beside her head, resting against the sofa. Back eyes closed, one hand still loosely touching his daughter's. He stood there for a long moment. Then he knocked softly on the open door. Natalie's eyes opened. She looked at him the way a person looks when they've been caught in something they don't have language for. Yet, not angry, not startled, just momentarily unguarded, in a way that was clearly not a state she was accustomed to. Marcus opened his mouth. He started with, "I'm so sorry," and continued from there, explaining the daycare, explaining the bench, explaining that he had been 12 feet away, explaining that he understood completely if she needed to make a call to building management, explaining whatever needed to be explained to delay the moment when she told him the job was over. Natalie looked at him. She looked at Lily, still asleep between them. "Is the hallway circuit done?" she asked. Marcus stopped. "Almost. Finish it," she said, "then come back for her." She stood, straightened her blazer, and walked back to her desk. The rabbit watched her from the center of it. She set it to one side without comment and picked up her folder. Marcus lifted Lily, gently settled her against his shoulder, and carried her back to the hallway bench. His hands were not entirely steady. He sat beside her and looked down at the toolbox and tried to figure out what exactly had just happened, and whether whatever it was would still cost him his job by the end of the day. Natalie's official reason was efficiency. She relayed it through her assistant Derek the following morning, a practical arrangement she called it, given that the maintenance work on the 38th floor was ongoing, and an unsupervised child in an active work corridor presented a liability issue. The solution was simple. Lily would sit in the assistant's area during working hours in the chair beside Derek's desk, which was visible from the hallway and safely away from anything electrical. Derek passed this along to Marcus with the careful neutrality of someone who had worked for Natalie Brennan long enough to know that her practical arrangements occasionally contained things she hadn't examined too closely herself. Marcus accepted without question. He was not in a position to question anything. Lily treated the arrangement as a promotion. By the second morning, she had established a routine. She would sit with Derek long enough to determine that he was in her assessment, busy with the computer, and therefore not available for conversation. Then she would gather whatever she'd brought that day, drawing a small stack of crayons, once a pine cone she'd found near the subway entrance, and considered significant, and carry it down the short hallway to Natalie's open door. She never knocked. It had not occurred to her that she should. Natalie never sent her away. That, too, appeared not to have occurred to her. On the third day, Lily stood in the center of the office, turned in a slow circle, and announced her conclusion. "This room is too sad. It needs yellow." Natalie, without looking up from her monitor, "It has windows." "Windows aren't yellow," Lily said. "Yellow is yellow." Derek, passing in the hallway with a stack of folders, caught the tail end of this exchange and kept walking. He had worked on this floor for 2 years. He had eaten lunch alone at his desk every single day of those 2 years, because Natalie ate at hers, and the floor had no common space worth using. That afternoon, Natalie ate half a sandwich on the sofa, while Lily colored on the floor beside her feet and explained the structural differences between a sun and a star. Derek noted this. He did not mention it to anyone, but he noted it. Marcus kept his distance. This was deliberate. He had constructed a precise and careful version of his presence on the 38th floor, visible when working invisible, otherwise apologizing on Lily's behalf each time she migrated toward Natalie's office, which Natalie consistently responded to by telling him to return to whatever he'd been doing. He understood that he was operating on borrowed tolerance. He did not intend to test its limits. He was replacing a section of conduit in the hallway on Thursday afternoon when the elevator opened and a woman stepped out. He recognized her before she fully turned around. Diane Voss was 61 and moved like someone who had spent 4 decades making rooms adjust to her rather than the other way around. Her hair was silver and deliberate. Her coat was the kind of dark wool that didn't crease. She walked toward the far end of the hall with her eyes on her phone, and as she passed, Marcus crouched on the floor beside his open toolbox. Her gaze moved over him, the way it moved over the light fixtures and the potted plant by the elevator, noting that they existed nothing more. She did not recognize him, or she did not choose to. Marcus stayed very still until she had passed through the glass door into the executive suite. Then he set down the piece of conduit in his hands and looked at the floor for a moment, reorienting himself. He had spent 18 months constructing a life in which Diane Voss occupied a sealed-off room. In his memory, the door labeled, "Handled not reopened." He had been laid off 3 months after his wife died. The official reason had been performance metrics. He had been the lead systems engineer on the reporting infrastructure he'd built for her company, and he had made the mistake of grieving visibly, of missing deadlines, of being a person whose personal life had come apart at the seams in a way that was inconvenient for the quarter's close. She had handed him the termination letter herself. She had not looked at him when she did it. He had kept out of a habit he couldn't entirely explain, even now a hard drive with every system he'd built there. Not as a weapon, not as insurance, just because deleting it had felt like losing the last record that the years had happened at all. The drive was in his bag. It was always in his bag. He picked up the conduit and went back to work. The conversation happened the next afternoon. Lily was under Natalie's desk. She had determined this was the best location for coloring because the light came in at a useful angle, and Marcus had been called in to look at an outlet near the window that had been flickering. It was a small job, 10 minutes at most, which meant he was in the room when Natalie looked up from her screen and said without particular preamble, "You have an engineering degree." Marcus glanced up from the outlet. "Systems engineering." "Yes." "The work order has you listed as general maintenance." "That's what the position is." Natalie looked at him steadily. She had the particular manner of someone who asked questions they already had partial answers to, not to gather information, but to determine how accurately the other person would fill in the rest. Marcus set down his screwdriver. There was no version of this conversation that was improved by making her wait. He told her about the systems engineering career, and about Diane Voss, and about the termination 3 months after his wife's accident, the accident that had left him and Lily alone in an apartment in Queens, with one income that had just been removed. He told it the way he told most things now, plainly without editorializing the way you described a weather event that had passed. He mentioned because it was relevant, and because he'd already said the rest of it, that he still carried backups of the infrastructure he'd built at his old firm, every reporting system, every data pipeline copied onto a portable drive out of an old Reflex. "I used to tell my team that data you don't back up is data you've already lost," he said. "I couldn't make myself delete it, even after." From under the desk, Lily said nothing. She was listening. She was always listening. Natalie was quiet for a moment in the way of someone running a calculation rather than managing a feeling. Then she turned her chair slightly away from the screen, and something in her posture changed, not softened exactly, but redistributed, like a building that had been holding weight in one place, finally allowing it to spread. "The acquisition," she said. "Diane's been presenting revised projections to the board. Numbers I can't source. Every time I request the original models, I get versions that don't match the decisions I made when I made them." She stopped. "I don't say this to people." "I know," Marcus said. "I've been doing this alone since my father handed me the company. I've never—" She stopped again. "I don't have a habit of letting anyone help me work through anything." Marcus looked at her. "I understand that feeling," he said. "Better than I'd like to." It was the most honest thing either of them had said to the other. The room held it without difficulty. Under the desk, Lily quietly selected a yellow crayon and began filling in the sun she'd been working on for the past 3 days. It was almost finished. She had decided it needed to be perfect before she gave it away. She was also in the private way of small children who have absorbed more than adults realize, beginning to understand that the two people in this room needed something from each other that neither of them had figured out how to ask for yet. She filed this information carefully. She would know what to do with it when the time came. Diane Voss called the emergency board meeting on a Friday. Marcus learned about it the way he learned most things on the 38th floor, incidentally, through the particular acoustic properties of a hallway that carried sound further than its designers had intended. He was coiling cable near the utility closet when Derek walked past with a printed agenda and a look on his face that he was working hard to keep professional. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the conference room at the end of the executive corridor. Diane had requested all 7 board members present. The agenda listed a single-item governance review. Marcus knew what that meant. He'd been in enough corporate buildings to understand the language. At 1:55, he watched Natalie walk past the hallway toward the conference room. She carried a leather folder. Her face was the same composed surface it always was. She did not look at him as she passed, which was normal, which was appropriate, which was how things worked between a CEO and a maintenance worker on her floor. He began packing his tools. He was not going to walk into that room. He had no standing to walk into that room, no invitation, no role, nothing that would explain his presence to anyone seated at that table. He was the man who fixed the outlets. He was the man whose daughter had wandered into an office that wasn't hers and fallen asleep against a woman who had every reason to have him removed from the building. He was not a person whose opinion on governance reviews was relevant. He zipped the bag closed. From down the hall, the conference room door stood slightly open. One board member had not yet arrived, and no one had thought to latch it. From the direction of Derek's desk, there was a small sound. A chair scraping back. Then the sound of feet, small feet, deliberate and certain, moving down the hallway. Marcus turned around. Lily was already halfway to the conference room. In both hands, held carefully against her chest, was a thick stack of drawings, bound with a pink ribbon she'd pulled from her hair that morning. She had been working on them all week. Marcus had assumed they were just drawings. "Lily." She pushed the conference room door open and walked in. Marcus stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Then he heard a voice he recognized as Diane Voss's say sharply, "What is this? Why is there a child in here?" He walked to the door. The conference room was long and glass-walled with 7 board members arranged along one side of the table, and Natalie seated at the far end, her folder open in front of her. Diane stood near the presentation screen, her posture, the rigid vertical of someone whose authority had just been interrupted by a 2.5-year-old in a yellow cardigan. Lily had placed her drawings on the table directly in front of Natalie. The pink ribbon had come slightly undone. "These are for you," Lily said. She pointed at Diane. "That lady looks angry. Is she the one being mean to you?" Natalie's expression did not change, but her hand had moved to the stack of drawings. "My daddy said good people need help," Lily continued with the measured confidence of someone delivering a prepared statement. "You're good. You didn't make us leave even when I went in your office without asking. You didn't make Daddy lose his job." She thought about this. "Also, you let me use your sofa. The first time we slept there together. You didn't get mad." The conference room was very quiet. Diane Voss said, her voice precise and cold. "Is this your child? What exactly is going on here?" Marcus was standing in the doorway in his maintenance uniform. He was the lowest-ranking person in that room by every conventional measure. He had no business being there, no invitation, no credentials that meant anything to anyone seated at that table. But he had something else. He reached into his bag, and his hand closed around the portable hard drive he'd carried for 2 years, without knowing until this moment exactly what he'd been carrying it for. He set the drive on the conference table without ceremony. It was a small thing, matte black, slightly scuffed at one corner, from 2 years in the bottom of a work bag, and it looked exactly like what it was. Something carried out of habit, not intention. Marcus slid it across the table toward the center and straightened up. "My name is Marcus Calloway," he said. "I'm the maintenance technician assigned to this floor. I built the reporting infrastructure that company ran on for 4 years before I was let go." He did not look at Diane when he said the next part. He looked at the board members because they were the ones who needed to understand it. Everything on that drive is original, time-stamped, unmodified. If you compare it against what's been presented here today, you'll find the figures don't match, because the figures that were presented here today were changed after the fact. The room did not erupt. Rooms like this one never erupted. What happened instead was a particular quality of stillness, the kind that precedes a serious recalibration. Diane Voss's voice came out flat and controlled. "You came into this meeting to settle a personal grievance." Marcus finally looked at her. She was exactly as he remembered, the same composed authority, the same quality of attention that evaluated rather than engaged. She had not changed. He supposed he had. "I came to this floor because I was assigned here," he said. "I'm standing in this room because my daughter walked in first. What I put on that table has nothing to do with what happened between us 2 years ago. It has to do with what's accurate." One of the board members, a man in his 60s at the far end of the table who had not spoken since Marcus entered, pulled the drive toward him and looked at it. "What format are the files in?" The reporting models are in the original software. The raw data exports are standard. Anyone with access to the system architecture can verify the timestamps independently. The board member looked at the drive. Then he looked at Natalie. Natalie had not moved since Marcus entered the room. Her folder was still open in front of her. Lily had climbed into the chair beside her at some point in the last few minutes and was sitting with her hands in her lap, watching the proceedings with the focused interest of someone following a story whose ending she had already decided on. Natalie said calmly and with precision, "I'd like to request that the board suspend today's vote, pending a full technical review of the source materials. I think that's a reasonable ask given what's just been introduced." Two board members were already talking quietly to each other. The man at the end of the table was turning the drive over in his hands. Diane stood at the front of the room, with her presentation still on the screen behind her, and for the first time since Marcus had known of her existence, she appeared to be recalculating. She gathered her materials. She did it slowly without rushing, because rushing would have been an acknowledgement. She said to the room in general, "I'll expect the review committee to reach out through proper channels." Then she walked to the door, and Marcus stepped to one side, and she left. No one said anything for a moment after the door closed. Then the man at the end of the table said, "We'll need a week, maybe 2. Natalie nodded. "That's fine." The vote was postponed indefinitely. Marcus learned this from Derek, who appeared in the hallway 40 minutes after the meeting adjourned and delivered the information with the careful understatement of someone who understood its full weight. The board had requested an independent audit of the projection models. 2 members had already indicated privately that they considered the matter resolved. Diane Voss had not been seen on the 38th floor since she walked out of the conference room. Marcus sat on the floor of the hallway with his back against the wall and his toolbox beside him and Lily in his lap, and he explained to her very quietly that walking into a board meeting without permission was not something she was allowed to do again, regardless of her reasons, regardless of how the situation resolved itself. Lily listened to this with the expression of someone filing information they considered interesting, but not personally binding. "But it worked," she said. "That's not the point." "What's the point?" Marcus looked at the ceiling. "The point is that you could have." He stopped because the honest answer was that he wasn't sure what she could have done wrong, given that everything she had done had been in its own chaotic way exactly right. "The point is that next time you tell me first." "Okay," Lily said in a tone that suggested she was agreeing to the principle while reserving judgment on its application. He was still working through a follow-up when he heard footsteps from the direction of the executive suite. He looked up. Natalie came around the corner and stopped when she saw them. She was still carrying the folder from the meeting. Lily's drawings, still bound with the pink ribbon slightly rumpled now, were tucked under her arm. She looked at the 2 of them on the floor for a moment. Then she did something Marcus had not anticipated. She sat down, not in a chair brought out from an office, not crouching briefly before standing back up. She sat down on the hallway floor, back against the wall, the same as him, close enough that their shoulders were almost level. She set the folder on her knees. She placed the drawings carefully on top of it. It was, he understood, entirely deliberate. The first time she had sat beside his daughter, it had been because she was too exhausted to make a different choice. This was not that. This was a choice made from a different place entirely. For a moment, none of them said anything. The hallway held its usual controlled silence. Outside the windows at the far end, Manhattan continued its argument with itself 38 floors below. Natalie looked straight ahead. "There's a position that's been vacant for 7 months. Lead systems engineer. The person before you." She stopped and adjusted this. "The person who held it was let go for reasons that I understood at the time as performance-related. I understand them differently now." Marcus kept his eyes on the middle distance. "What changed?" "I saw the original work," she said. "It was good. The kind of good that doesn't come from someone who stopped caring. It comes from someone who was being asked to function in circumstances that made functioning very difficult. She shifted the folder on her knees. I should have looked more carefully at the time. I didn't. Marcus turned his head and looked at her directly. Are you sure about this? Natalie met his eyes. There was no performance in her expression, no calculation, just the particular clarity of someone who has run a decision through every available filter and arrived finally at the other side of it. I'm more certain about this than anything I've decided in the past 6 months, she said. From Marcus's lap, Lily lifted her head. She looked at Natalie. She looked at her father. She looked at the drawings tucked under Natalie's arm, the stack she had spent a week assembling, the son she had taken 3 days to finish because she decided it needed to be perfect before it could be given away. She nodded once with the gravity of someone ratifying a decision they consider sound. Then she reached over and placed her small hand on top of Natalie's, the hand resting on the folder, the same hand that had held hers on the sofa days ago, while they both slept in a room that wasn't meant for sleeping. She patted it twice lightly, and then left her hand there. Good, Lily said. Daddy can stay on this floor. I like this floor. She thought about this. The sofa is soft, and it's cold in the right way. Marcus looked at his daughter. He looked at the woman sitting on the hallway floor beside him, in a $4,000 blazer, with a child's crayon drawings tucked under her arm. And he understood that the architecture of the next part of his life had just shifted in a way that would take him some time to fully map. He had come to the 38th floor to fix a junction in a lighting circuit. He had brought a hard drive out of habit and a daughter out of necessity, and he had spent days trying to make himself as small and unobtrusive as the job required. He had understood his role precisely. He had not understood, could not have understood, standing in that hallway on the first morning with his toolbox and his apologetic explanations, that the thing most in need of repair on this floor had nothing to do with electrical systems, that it had been identified before he could identify it himself by a 2.5-year-old who had seen an open door and treated it the only way she knew how, as an invitation. Lily was already calculating whether today was a good day to ask if the office could get a yellow chair. She decided it was,